Hello and welcome to today's webcast hosted by the Sales Management Association. Our session will start in just a few moments. First, a few quick announcements. Please note that we will not open attendees' audio or video lines during Q&A today. However, we do very much welcome your questions and comments. We encourage you to submit those. You can do this at any time by simply typing them into the chat window. You'll see that just to the right of the video display window on our website. As an additional reminder, please note that our session today will be recorded. We will make today's archived recording available to members on our website. They will also be able to download slides from today's session there. Our session today is one in a series of web-based Sales Management Association presentations that feature practitioners and thought leaders in the field of sales force effectiveness. The Sales Management Association is a professional association for sales operations, sales enablement, and sales leadership professions. We provide our members with research, case studies, training, peer networking, and professional development opportunities. If you're joining us for the first time, we invite you to consider membership in the Sales Management Association and to visit us online. You can find us at salesmanagement.org. I'm Bob Kelly, Sales Management Association Chairman. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce two excellent speakers, Michelle Vizana and Wayne St. Amand. I'd like to introduce them now. Wayne St. Amand is Chief Marketing Officer at Allego, a provider of mobile interactive learning and enablement technology for distributed teams. Wayne is responsible for Allego's global corporate and product marketing initiatives. He was previously Chief Marketing Officer and Senior Vice President at Nielsen's Marketing Effectiveness Business Unit. Wayne has grown multiple technology businesses, playing a key role in one IPO and three separate $100 million plus exits. Wayne is joined by Michelle Vizana. She is co-founder and Chief Strategy Officer at Vantage Point Performance, a global sales training and development firm. She's co-author of the highly regarded book, Cracking the Sales Management Code, and author of a more recent book on sales coaching, available now, called Crushing Quota. A frequent speaker on sales leadership topics, she has more than 30 years experience in sales and marketing. She's certainly no stranger to our audiences and is a consistently very highly rated speaker at both our online and in-person events. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the screen now. Let's see. Sorry, we'll get you all on here. And let's get everyone the same size. That's important. So welcome, everyone. It's great to have you guys with us.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Bob. Pleasure to be here.
All right, so I'll let you take it away. Thank you.
All right, fantastic. You're going to switch over the screen, Bob, to the PowerPoint? Excellent, fantastic. We are really excited. I think Michelle, myself, and Bob are excited to really be presenting this topic to you today, because it's one of the hottest things being talked about in just about every industry, but certainly in the sales sector, which is this idea of cognitive technologies, which is a fancy term for artificial intelligence or machine learning, right? Every vendor, I would say us at Allego included, is pushing forth some approach that involves cognitive technologies to make the job of sales training and sales enablement easier. And this is one of the key concepts here, is that it's not about doing the job for the sales manager. It's really about practical ways that these technologies can be worked to make the job of selling easier and more productive. And we've got incredible research that Michelle has performed that's going to inform these approaches. And we're really going to take a practical stance in telling you the things that you need to keep in mind as you navigate this ecosystem in this territory as a sales manager or a seller. So with that, we will jump in. These 6 steps are really the key things to keep in mind. And we say here cognitive technology in the flow of work, because the point is, applied properly, technologies like machine learning and AI and research based in those technologies can be very practically put to use in your journey as a seller. So these 6 steps: content creation, onboarding, ongoing learning, conversation intelligence, content findability, and ultimately buyer journey and virtual selling. We're going to talk to you over the next 30 minutes or so about how these cognitive technologies apply in very practical terms to each one of these areas. So let's start first with content creation. And I think, Michelle, we're going to hand it right over to you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Wayne. So we know that, content really is the name of the game. How do you get the right content in the hands of the right people at the right time so that they can do a better job and basically sell more stuff? So I'm going to share with you some research into how we use machine learning to identify the kind of content that sellers need most to be most effective within their job. But before I do that, I'm going to get some feedback from you. So we're going to actually launch a poll. And what's going to happen is you're going to see a poll show up toward the bottom of your screen. And the first poll is, how many of you believe that one sales methodology is sufficient for all the buying situations either you or your salespeople face? Yes, you believe it. No, you don't. So if you'll take a moment and vote on that, I think your input is going to be really interesting, especially when we begin sharing the results of one of the largest sales methodology studies ever conducted.
And Michelle, just a housekeeping note, I'll just remind everyone that the poll actually is on the screen right now below the video display window. So if you go ahead and vote there, then in just a moment, we'll, or whenever you're ready, Michelle, we'll show some results.
Okay. So one of the questions that sales and sales enablement leaders often ask is, what is the best sales methodology? And how do I know? Because I have to train my salespeople, I have to enable my salespeople. How do I make that choice? And how do I know I'm making the right choice? So Bob, do you have any results that we can take a look at right now? Because I think it would be interesting to lead into the findings of the research.
We do indeed. We can come back and see how these are going as we progress.
Okay, so it's an overwhelming no. I do not believe that one sales methodology is sufficient for all buying situations. So Wayne, why don't we go ahead and take a look at the research? Because the research supports your perspective that there really is no one methodology that works in every situation. In fact, what the research shows is that top performing sellers, they don't use one approach. They actually display 4 different patterns of selling behavior or selling strategies, not just one. So when organizations drive for standardization, oftentimes what they're doing is they're enabling their sellers in a way that works in only some of the sales situations they face. When we study top performers, what we found is that there's 4 patterns of selling behavior, not one. The situation the sellers faced actually drove this selection of the strategy they used. And not only that, but each sales force, when they go to sell what they sell to their customers, they typically face between 4 and 6 unique buying situations. And when they face those situations, they then determine the strategy that they feel will work best. In addition, what the research shows is the top performing managers actually coach to activities. They don't coach to outcomes. So we're going to examine in just a few minutes what that means from a machine learning perspective. But what does all this research have to do with cognitive technology anyway? So Wayne, if you'll put the next slide on, that would be helpful. Where cognitive technology comes into play is we can marry the findings of this innovative research that indicates that the field of play is more complex than we originally anticipated. And we can use machine learning to really narrow that field of play in a way that makes the selling job a little bit more discreet and a little bit easier. So that when we ask sellers to be agile, to basically change up what they're doing, we can give them directions as to when would you do that, why would you do that, and how would you do that. So the next slide shows a little bit about how we can use machine learning specifically to identify patterns, predictive patterns. And the first predictive patterns that we can identify are the buying factors that influence how buyers prefer to buy and how sellers basically adjust their approach based on the buying situations they encounter. What I'd like to point out is that what we found in this research is that when we studied over 25 buying factors, what we found is they fit into 5 categories. And you can see those 5 categories on this slide. Most of the time, when we think about marketing efforts, we often think of buyer personas and the buying journey. And if you think about those 2 elements and you look at these 5 factors, they only represent a small part of what buyers care about when they buy what it is that your sellers are selling. In addition, we can use these machine learning algorithms to identify predictive patterns on which sales strategy of the 4 patterns we've identified leads to wins and even losses in each of the unique buying situations. We'll talk a little bit more about that a little while later. But right now, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Wayne, to talk a little bit about onboarding.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michelle. So we're moving now from content creation to onboarding. And of course, onboarding is a consumer of content, right? You can't onboard and train without the right kind of content. But in order to optimize onboarding, you want to make sure that that content is being placed into a system that is ultimately incredibly usable by the sales team and is something that is intuitively geared around the seller. So a very seller-centric experience of onboarding and making sure that all of the content that's available is available in an in the flow of work style. What do we mean by that? Well, when a rep is being trained, being onboarded, they're being fed by a fire hose of content. You know, if you're smart, you're going to take some of the research findings from Michelle's firm, and you're going to let that be infused into the content that you've created for onboarding, so that you know what different paths the sellers need to take to be situationally aware, right, as they go deeper into their training process. You want to make sure that when optimizing onboarding, making it available in the flow of work at the moment of need, that's all about being self-directed, right? So you can use AI technology to guide a seller based on sensed behaviors in the CRM system or the training system, but you should also make sure that that content is available, searchable, so that it can be easily found, and the rep can direct themselves through that onboarding content wherever they are in the world. Right? We are living in a hybrid world. The other thing that's really important about making decisions here about onboarding and the systems associated with it is that the content recommendations that are surfaced by the system should be smart enough, and this is where AI comes into play, that those recommendations are based on the role and the experience of the seller, right? There are junior people being onboarded, there are senior people being onboarded. Onboarding could have something to do with a new product launch, a new market segment, for example. So the content recommendations have to be smart enough to flex with the needs of the training exercise and the seller themselves. And then we always say, hey, start with the end in mind, and start with a knowledge of where your rep is at the beginning of your program, so that you can make sure your system is telling you how much advancement has that rep had over time, and are they actually improving? Again, AI, these cognitive technologies, if done properly, can give you a strong sense through metrics and reporting where your rep started out and how much distance they have to traverse to get to where they need to be over time. So let's move now into ongoing learning, our third step here, our practical step of using cognitive technology in the flow of work. So let's think about ongoing learning. This is all about fighting the forgetting curve. We all know that a large percentage, you can see this little data point here in the lower right-hand portion of your screen, 80% of information that's learned is lost within 30 days if not reinforced. So your system should actively work to quiz your reps based on what they appear to be forgetting over time. And the system should be smart enough to sense, hey, this rep is really retaining, of the 10 things they need to know, really retaining these 6 or 7. And I'm going to stop training so aggressively on those because there's clear mastery over time. And I'm going to focus on these 3 or 4 points that don't seem to be getting across to the rep. And you want the system over time to keep testing against the mastery just enough to make sure that the mastery hasn't become something that is forgotten, while continuing to reinforce that set of information that the rep doesn't yet have a grasp on. The other thing to keep in mind is that you want your system ultimately to be able to make these kinds of content recommendations with a sense for what's actually happening for the rep. So there's a lot of data in your CRM system. Your training system should have enough sensitivity, if you will, enough knowledge of the buying situations as suggested by what's being tracked in your CRM system around that opportunity to recommend training content or even sales collateral, sales tools that are appropriate for that buying situation, and that ultimately is correlated with positive outcomes that perhaps their peer group, when using that content, they've actually had positive outcomes as well. And then I think from a playbook's perspective, Michelle, you may have had something to offer on that point.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to this really powerful interplay, Wayne, between getting the right content in the system and then serving that content up at the right time in the right way. So there's a lot of energy around playbooks, right? And there has been for many years now, because sellers want very tailored and customized content that relates very strongly to the way their buyers want to buy. So this playbook content, if you get the right content in the system and you tag that content correctly, and you are tracking through, as sellers are pursuing opportunities, then the right information can be served up at the right time to create the outcomes that you want. Part of what was interesting about this playbook development is some of the machine learning that we can do with your data for your sellers to identify what are you facing, what buying situations are your sellers facing, and what are your top performers doing that wins in those situations, to codify that and use that information very specifically to build playbooks that are very tailored to your organization so they can live and breathe within this content management system and be delivered at the right time to create the outcomes. So that's my only add there, Wayne.
It's a really good and important point. AI is never, and these systems are never going to create the content for you, right? But they absolutely, given the right data, the right analysis based on the sales cycles and the kinds of customers that you have, they can be and need to be a really critical part in building that foundational content that the system then intelligently assembles at the right moment in time for the rep who may need a particular piece of content versus another piece of content. And that's where AI can be really powerful, both in examining what are those scenarios and then in assembling them at the right moment in time, at the moment of need in the flow of work for the rep to make them as productive as possible.
Perfect. So Wayne, let's talk a little bit about how we actually determine what the right content is. There is so much energy in the marketplace right now about buyer preferences, buyers wanting a more tailored buying experience. And the challenging part is the situation sellers face are far more complex than oftentimes our CRMs will allow us to really understand. And there's also often questions about CRM hygiene, right? Is the information in there correct? Is it updated? And so oftentimes there's richness that can't necessarily be gathered from how your clients interact with your website. And it can't necessarily be gathered from your CRM system. It really needs to be pulled from the knowledge base of your sellers. And what we know is that your sellers have insights that if you tap into, can provide a wealth of information that not only used for onboarding, but ongoing training as well. So this is an example here of how cognitive technology can help you better understand the buying situations your sellers face. So this is an example from a real client. And I mentioned earlier that there's these 5 categories of buying factors that have been revealed in the research. And within these 5 categories, there are over 25 individual factors that are attributes of how buyers buy. So for this particular client example, what we were able to do, what you can do, is use machine learning to then tease out the specifics of which buying factors are your sellers facing that are driving the most influence in how their buyers buy. And for this particular client, you can see there were 5 very specific factors that had the most influence on the buying situations their sellers faced. So you can see research experience, number of competitors, number of potential departments they were working with, initial engagement stage, and the role of the decision owner. Of all of the factors that could be at play, these were the 5 that were most important for this particular client. And if you go to the next slide, Wayne, what machine learning can then help you do is analyze those factors and see how do they line up to form very unique buying situations that your sellers face. So in this particular situation, this client had 4 very discrete and very unique buying situations that their sellers faced based on those 5 factors that were most important in how their buyers buy. And this information alone is marketing gold, right? Lots of marketers want to understand their customers in this really specific way. But that's really only the first part of the story. The second part of the story about how machine learning can help you is that machine learning, if you go to the next slide, Wayne, machine learning can help tease out how are your sellers displaying these 4 patterns of behavior when they face each of these buying situations. So you can see this chart shows 4 very discrete buying situations. And then you can see the legend over to the right shows the 4 patterns of selling behavior that were uncovered in the research, right? Consultative, or a more needs-based approach, disruptive, a more challenge-based approach, financial, a more ROI-driven approach, and competitive, which is more of a product-driven approach. So those 4 are the 4 patterns that were discovered in the research. So if you're wondering which pattern works best in the situations my sellers face, you can use machine learning to gain these kinds of insights. Here's why this is so critical. If you look at this first buying situation, you can see there's the optimal pattern of selling behavior that's most likely to lead to a win is the one that's the least used. So, therein lies some really interesting insight, right? The only time in this particular client situation or environment where the sellers were using the optimal selling pattern that was most likely to lead to a win was this third buying situation. So this can not only give you better insight into how your buyers prefer to buy, but then what should my sellers be doing in order to maximize their chances of a win in each of these buying situations? And if we're to take it a step further, Wayne, if you could take it to the next slide. The next thing, yeah, go ahead.
One thing I'll add and just encourage people to realize is that, and you've probably seen this, Michelle, too often this is left up to luck, right?
Yes.
There is not a really strong foundational sense of even what the scenarios are, nor when and how to apply them, right? So we want to say that if you do the work up front and you choose the right systems that use machine learning and AI, you can take the luck out of this picture, right? And then, Michelle, I'll let you keep going.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more, Wayne. The other thing that machine learning can help with is not just seller behavior and buying behavior, but sales manager behavior, right? We all know that the sales management job is hard. We know that it's a key pivotal role in any organization. We also know from research that managers that coach to activities outperform managers that don't, and they get 30% more of their sellers to quota. But the next question is, okay, if coaching to activities is really the way to go, there's hundreds of activities that a manager could coach to. Which ones matter most? And you can even use machine learning within your organization to tease out the pattern of activity focus that your high-performing managers display so that you can then orient your core performing managers to focus on those activities that have an outsized impact on seller performance. And you can see here on this graph, for a particular client, we identified 5 very specific activities that were most highly related to higher seller performance. And getting managers to orient more of their coaching around those activities can have an outsized impact on seller performance and overall organization performance. So Wayne, back to you.
All right, fantastic. All right, we've got our next, again, practical area where you can put cognitive technology, whether AI, machine learning, to work in your business on, within your sales team today, right now. And I think what we have next coming up is another poll. So Bob, if you could launch the next poll, which has to do with conversation intelligence. Is your business using conversation intelligence today? Now, I hope many of you know the definition of this term, but in case you don't, broadly, it's a set of technologies that automatically records the interactions that your sales team is having with their prospects. It is then ideally using natural language processing technology, some kind of artificial intelligence technology to transcribe those conversations and start to produce analytics around what's being said. Once you have that data and you've got all that text analysis that's been applied, you can do some really interesting things around that intelligence, that conversation intelligence, to coach your team and make your team better over time. So, Bob,
Wayne, sorry to interrupt. I'll just remind our audience to vote. Just look for the box labeled poll number 2. It's just below the video display window on our website. So we do have some votes tallied so far. When you're ready, I'll let you see those. Wayne.
Let's see where it stands so far. All right, lots of opportunity here. It's pretty stark, the number of people that aren't using it. I love to see this because it speaks to market opportunity, number 1. Number 2, it speaks to a huge opportunity to improve what your sales team is doing out in the real world. Back before COVID, when sales managers were traveling a whole heck of a lot more, there was the concept of the ride along, right? Or the sit beside your rep and listen to the call, listen in on the call, and then coach them live based on what's going on. Now, buyers don't necessarily want to take as many meetings. Sellers aren't traveling nearly as much. Sales managers aren't traveling nearly as much. So conversation intelligence has become a way of really observing the unobservable, which is the hundreds, perhaps thousands of sales calls via Zoom, over the phone, or WebEx, or whatever technology you use, capturing those recordings. We call it game tape because it's actual live interactions with customers, not the practice sessions that maybe get recorded in advance, but the real world application of that seller's skill or lack thereof in dealing with the prospects. And the whole point here is that we want to be able to surface and act on coachable moments, all at scale. You can see this point here on the lower right-hand side of the screen. Only 20% of sales calls are reviewed in one way or another. I actually think this number is aggressive. I think it's probably a lot less than 20%. If you use a conversation intelligence technology, you can instantly get to 100%, because the AI involved in this is doing an analysis of what was said, right? And it can automate the review and flag issues with every single call. And you can zero in, if it was a 1-hour call, you can zero in on the 5 worst minutes in that call and really zero in on what needs help. How can you coach that? You can also, by the way, zero in on the 5 best minutes, or the 3 best minutes, or the 10 best minutes, and use those recording snippets as an exemplar of what to do, right? Coach against the positive as well as the negative. But the important thing is you get to touch many more of those rep interactions, And the system can automate recommendations, training recommendations, or even follow-up content recommendations based on the discussion that the seller had with the prospect in the real world. You can also implement training based on what the conversation intelligence AI is picking up. So if you want to certify rep proficiency with a particular pitch deck, for example, you can use those real world interactions, not the practices, not the memorized, rehearsed, situations, but the actual real world situations, and use those as your certification and proficiency tests. And obviously, if you do this well, you can understand holistically how your team is performing, if they're getting better, or hopefully not worse, but better over time. And you want to be able to replicate that winning behavior and do it at scale. Conversation intelligence is a path to do that. One of the technologies that's just emerging now that works oftentimes in conjunction with conversation intelligence is this idea of AI virtual coaching. The best scenario associated with virtual coaching or AI-powered coaching is that those AI coaches can be customized for the task at hand, the coaching task at hand. To use a sports analogy for a moment, you wouldn't have a batting coach coaching the outfielders, right? Because coaching is not a one-size-fits-all task, right? Your AI system should be customizable to the task at hand. So as you're evaluating these technologies, you're going to want to ask the kinds of questions that say, is my system applying a one-size-fits-all approach when using AI? Or is it allowing me to customize that AI approach, that AI coaching approach, to be specialized for the particular task at hand? Somebody who is calling on mid-market accounts is going to use a different approach than somebody who's calling on six-figure enterprise deals with higher complexity in the sales cycle. You want your AI coaching to be able to flex with those two tasks, right? The other thing that AI virtual coaches can do is scale around specific high-impact activities. Again, the difference between enterprise sellers versus perhaps mid-market or small business sellers. Identifying points of interest in conversations, and ultimately, again, if you have a virtual coaching system that's integrated with your conversation intelligence system, and have all of those things integrated with your learning and coaching systems, these things play together to then recommend exercises and learning content based on what the virtual coach is seeing and based on what the system is recording and observing in the real world. It's really, really powerful stuff. And just really quickly, you can see this sort of wheel of activities. All these things are super common in most corporate environments: onboarding and training, launching and rollouts, content management for sellers, virtual selling activities, which are obviously extremely popular now and will probably continue to be, and then ongoing coaching and collaboration. Conversation intelligence and the AI coaching that acts as a foundation for it plays a role in each one of these areas and makes it stronger and infuses it with the real world. Too often, training initiatives don't have enough infusion of what's really happening. And that's what CI, what conversation intelligence, if done right, will do. It will infuse the real world of seller and rep behavior into each of these key areas for your endeavors. All right, second to last practical point, the area of content findability, right? How good is content if you can't find it? So finding it is really, really critical. So the system of choice, you hope, will help you curate the content and put it in a recommendation feed. So when your reps log into that content, the system will have a sense of awareness of what your rep is struggling with, what your rep is doing well, what kinds of deals, the deal mix that your rep is handling, and will and also look at the past performance through training exercises and past performance of selling, and will make recommendations on the fly in a feed as they log into their computer or as they look at their phone, their mobile device, because all this stuff happens from anywhere in the world on any device at any time. Your content should be easy to find, and frankly, the system should surface what the rep needs without the rep even having to do anything. The system should provide suggestions for how to tag content, help you with auto tagging behavior. And then of course the search, we're all super familiar with search. That search should be infused with AI as well. There should be autocomplete technology. The search bar itself should be a vehicle for suggesting the content that every rep needs, that every rep is looking for. So there are a lot of ways where you can use this underlying cognitive technology to help the seller, help the rep find the content they need and actually predict the content that the seller is going to need. All right, our final point, Michelle, buyer journey and virtual selling. So I think in bringing these points up here, the whole point is to really kind of recap what we want to cover. And I think these first 2 points are things that you wanted to cover, right, Michelle?
Absolutely. And I can't say enough about this interplay between determining the right content through cognitive technologies and really mining the gold that exists within your sales force so that you can then develop assets and collateral that help your sellers, number one, understand the buyers that they're facing and understand how those preferences shake out in terms of their selling approach. So your playbooks should really be all about how your buyers want to buy, how to tease that out, and then how to then sell effectively based on changing buyer preferences. And the other thing to keep in mind, Wayne, over time, and this is where AI can also come into play, is buyer preferences change over time. New buying factors emerge. New patterns of selling emerge. And although we know that these 4 patterns of selling have revealed themselves again and again in the research, there are individual tactics that can come into play at any point along a buyer's journey. And being able to understand, based on changing buyer preferences, which selling patterns should we then suggest in order to drive better outcomes. So in a nutshell, things change over time. We need mechanisms to understand how things have changed regarding how your buyers are buying and how you need to sell differently to adapt to that. And by tracking these buying indicators or buying factors and sales tactic usage, we can stay ahead of how our environment's changing and then change our content accordingly.
Yeah, I was going to say, Michelle, I couldn't agree more. Again, we've talked quite a bit about how important it is to do the work up front to understand the dynamics that your buyer will face and to create the right content that can be drawn from at the right moment in time. Like, absolutely critical. If you pair that upfront work with a system that's smart enough to sense, to record the data, to capture the data, and then use some of these cognitive technologies to sense where the buyer is in their journey, right? The technology can work in the background to make it easier for the seller to identify what that next best move is, right? And that's the ideal. It's never going to replace a buyer's decision, rather a seller's decision-making process completely. But if it can help them put their right foot forward, then you're doing the right things, right? You're doing the right things up front. You're doing the right things in choosing a system that is sensitive enough to pick up on these things and smart enough to put the right content, whether it be training content or market-facing content for the prospect, in front of the seller to build that model of success, right? To execute the ways that's going to drive great outcomes for the sellers and the companies involved.
And that really brings us to the last point, Wayne, which is when it comes to replicating top performer behavior and building these playbooks, one of the things that cognitive technologies can do, in summary, is it can help us identify what are the factors that impact how our buyers buy. How do those factors orient themselves into unique buying situations that each company faces, that each sales force faces? when we identify the selling patterns that win in those buying situations, we can then leverage our top performing sellers and glean even more detail about what they do, what they say, and what they show when executing the tactics in each of those patterns of selling behavior. So it gets much more specific, much more user friendly, and it gives companies a way to, in a very well codified way, replicate the top performing behavior in a way that's easily executable. So that's,
Yeah,
go ahead. Yeah.
So I think we're at that point now where we're going to transition to questions. And hopefully we will have a few questions. We'll give people a moment to think of those questions and start to type them in, send them to Bob. In the meantime, we wanted to bring your attention to some content. If you liked this webinar, but you want to go deeper, here are two great pieces of content. You can dig in on, they're free. You can go to the various places on the web that are indicated above and dig deeper on these things. Obviously, there's only so much time, and we just kind of hit the treetops in this presentation. But this content will give you a better kind of deeper dive on some of these kind of core topics. Bob, should we transition to Q&A at this point?
Indeed, let's do. Thank you. Great presentation. Appreciate your insights today. We do have a number of questions. I'll take just another moment and remind everyone that you can submit questions by typing them into this chat window to the right of the video display, or you can email them directly to us at support@salesmanagement.org. And when you do that, one of our highly paid interns will run and get the question and bring it over to me, and we'll ask it on your behalf. We do have a couple of questions already, so let's get to those. The first question has to do with smaller companies. Do the approaches that you're talking about work for sales teams of 20 or less?
Is that the approach around sales agility and identifying buying situations?
Well, that might be a good place to start. The questioner didn't specify what exactly in your presentation they were referring to, but maybe you could draw some distinctions around what solutions you've talked about so far are applicable for smaller firms and which aren't.
So what we found over time is that sales agility is necessary for a sales force of any size. Some of the cognitive technologies around teasing out the right content are a little harder when you get below 50 salespeople. However, the patterns of selling behavior that lead to wins are trainable and teachable to any size sales force. And the buying factors that drive different strategy selection are also quite easy to understand and tease out. So we've worked with a variety of companies with fewer than 50 salespeople, say 20 salespeople, even 15 salespeople, to be able to help them understand what these patterns of selling behavior are and to recognize the buying situation profiles where those patterns win. So yes, it absolutely applies.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Just offer that from a software perspective. We usually look at 20-person sales teams as kind of the minimum size typically. I would say this is applicable to a sales team of 5 if you're all remote, right? You need technology to draw you together to be able to operate asynchronously, to leverage all these insights that you're not getting from being together, right? But typically budgets get in the way, and you tend to need to have a sales team that's at least roughly 20 people in size for you to be considering technologies like this. But yeah, 20 is a good fit, 20 on up.
Gotcha. Thank you very much, Wayne. I want to stick with you for the next question. The questioner asks, can ask you really just to elaborate a little bit on how machine learning tailors learning to individual salespeople.
Yeah, so it's all about the data. The work that Michelle's firm does to identify the dynamics that are going to occur for a particular company with a particular set of markets, different kind of selling dynamics and audience segments, and understanding, okay, you're going to run the gamut of 4 or 5 different approaches, and for this kind of a customer, this kind of a sales situation, go and use this one, right? That can apply to an individual seller, right? As a matter of fact, you would argue every sale is an individual seller. All of these cognitive technologies are designed to get better for the individual seller. Old approaches were always one size fits all, like literally every single time. Here's our process. Let's push everyone through it. Some will perform well, some won't. You have your washouts, you have your leaders, so on and so forth. The beauty of these AI technologies, or cognitive assisted, cognitive guided technologies, is they are designed to be highly customized for each individual different person who uses them, and to make each individual as productive as they can be. So I would argue, yes, they're even better now for the individual seller, because we can customize. We can do better for the individual seller than those one-size-fits-all approaches of the past.
Great, thank you. Michelle, question for you, maybe a point of clarification. Someone is interested in the research you cited. Can you provide more information about the information that the research that you're talking about related to sales methodology?
Yes, absolutely. You can actually go on our website at vantagepointperformance.com, and you can pull down an article that says why agile salespeople outperform challengers. That particular white paper on our website details the research that led to these findings. And there's a series of 4 different research studies that took place over a 6-year period that revealed these insights. So absolutely. I couldn't really get into too much detail here because it would take me probably an hour to explain all the research, but you can easily pull down that article from our website, why agile sellers outperform challengers.
I'll point out that some of the research that you're citing from a professor at Florida State, Lef Bonnie, is also included in our resource
Absolutely.
library under some of the conference archives. So plenty of available content related to that.
In fact, Dr. Bonnie is actually cited in that study that's on our website, that article, why agile sellers outperform challengers. That research originated out of the Florida State University Sales Institute. We have further validated and expanded that research.
Thank you. Michelle, let's stick with you for the next one. We had a questioner who wants to know just how long does it take to implement this? I'm just going to read you their question verbatim. They apologize. They say, I know this is a broad question, but could you share the kind of effort and time required to implement this, assuming you have good input data? So they want to know about the time and effort required to do the analysis and load information into the tool.
So it takes us roughly 8 weeks to gather the data. There's a series of interviews that happen pretty quickly before we go into data gathering mode. Once we gather data from sellers and sales managers, we gather data on wins and losses. Then it takes us a couple of weeks to analyze the data, and then we prepare a report out. So from beginning to end, it takes between 10 and 12 weeks to gather this level of detailed insight around buying factors, unique buying situations, selling patterns that win, and then build out those playbooks for what high performers do, say, and show when handling those different sales strategies.
Yeah, and I think from the software side, depending on the size of the team, the goals, the complexity, I mean, you can be up and running in 30 days. Or if you're doing something for a much larger global rollout with higher levels of complexity, it can take you months, right? But the simplest approach is you could buy and be up and running within the quarter is the way I would approach it.
Terrific, thank you. I'm going to try to fit one more question in. Question is, how does AI power search? Wayne, maybe you can stick with this one. I think you referenced this in the presentation. Can you provide more information about how artificial intelligence can actually make search better?
Yeah, I mean, it is all about prediction, right? And this, frankly, is not all that complicated. If anyone has ever used Google and has had, predictive search turned on, because you can actually turn it off, where you start typing and then Google completes your search or gives you a series of suggestions of content, and you say, oh, that was what I wanted, and you scroll down to the third one and you click on it, right? That little thing that seems incredibly simple, right, takes a ton of horsepower from a technology perspective to start to predictively suggest the things we think you're actually looking for before you complete your search. So that idea of like typing ahead, and it magically completing your thought for you and suggesting the things so you don't have to finish. That's what we're talking about. That's how AI helps make search more effective and more efficient for the searcher.
Terrific. Thank you. Well, we're running up against the top of the hour, so I'm going to cut off questions at this point. I'd like to thank you both for really an excellent presentation. Wayne St. Amand and Michelle Visana, thank you so much today.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Bob.
And before I sign off, I'll just remind our audience that our next Sales Management Association web presentation is on June 16th, when we'll host a session on best practices in incentive compensation for high growth companies. You can learn about this session and many others on our website at salesmanagement.org. I'm Bob Kelly, Sales Management Association Chairman. Thanks again for your time and attention today. Goodbye until next time.